The Valorian hegemony had ruled the stars for 10,000 years. They had conquered over 200 species across 3 galaxies. No one had ever stopped them. No one had ever tried. When their ships appeared in the sky, civilizations simply surrendered and hoped for mercy. There was never any mercy, but they hoped anyway. On a Tuesday morning in March of the year 2347, exactly 9,900 Valorian warships dropped out of hyperspace above the planet Earth. They came in perfect formation, their hulls dark against the cold void, their weapons already warming. Admiral Kethver stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the small blue world below. He had done this many times before. He expected nothing different today. Humanity had only discovered faster than light travel 40 years ago. Their fleet numbered barely 300 ships. Their colonies were young and weak. By every measure that mattered, they were prey. Commander Jake Sullivan was eating breakfast in his quarters aboard the destroyer Resolute when the alarm sounded. He was 42 years old, with gray hair at his temples and calm brown eyes that had seen nothing of war. He had joined the fleet because he loved the stars, not because he wanted to fight. In 30 seconds, he was on the bridge. In 60 seconds, he understood that everything had changed. The scanner display looked like it was broken. There were so many contacts that the screen had turned into a solid mass of red. Jake counted the numbers scrolling across the bottom and felt something cold settle in his stomach. Nearly 10,000 ships. 10,000. Sir, his sensor officer said quietly, they are not responding to hails. Jake nodded slowly. He had read the reports about the Valorian hegemony. Everyone in the fleet had read them. They knew what was coming. They had prepared for 20 years, ever since the Mendari traders had first warned them about the conquerors who moved between the stars. But knowing something and seeing it were very different things. In Houston, Texas, Fleet Admiral Catherine Brooks received the emergency transmission at 9:31 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. She was 61 years old, a career officer who had built the modern human fleet from nothing. She had short gray hair, sharp green eyes, and a face that showed no fear even now. She had 17 minutes before the enemy would reach optimal weapons range. 17 minutes to organize the defense of Earth against an enemy that outnumbered them 30-1. Catherine began issuing orders with calm precision. Her voice never wavered. Her hands never shook. Around her, the command center staff worked with desperate speed, but she remained the still center of the storm. She had always known this day might come. She had spent 15 years preparing for it. Every human warship carried secrets. Every colony had hidden defenses. Every citizen of Earth had been quietly trained for this possibility. The government had never announced these preparations. They had not wanted to cause panic. But they had not been idle. The Valorian fleet moved toward Earth with the confidence of predators who had never known defeat. Admiral Kethver watched the tiny human ships forming a defensive line near Mars and felt something like amusement. He had seen this before so many times. The desperate formation, the hopeless defiance. In an hour, perhaps 2, these creatures would be broken. Their world would be harvested. Their people would join the other slave species of the hegemony. He gave the order to advance. Jake Sullivan received the fleet-wide transmission at 9:42 a.m. The words appeared on his screen in simple text, and he read them 3 times to make sure he understood. Operation Prometheus was active. He felt his blood run cold even as his hands moved across the controls. Around him, his crew of 180 men and women went silent. They knew what those words meant. They had trained for this scenario in simulators. They had hoped it would never happen. Now it was happening, and they had to decide what kind of people they were. Jake looked at his bridge crew. His first officer, a woman named Linda Hayes, who had served with him for 6 years. His weapons officer, a young man named Chris Parker, who had a daughter back on Earth. His navigator, Danny Webb, who had only been married for 3 months. They were all looking at him, waiting. "You know the plan," Jake said quietly. "You know what we have to do. I will not order anyone to do this. If anyone wants to leave, you can take an escape pod, and no one will think less of you." No one moved. No one spoke. They simply waited for orders. Jake felt something like pride burning in his chest. These were his people. This was his crew. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The first Valorian ships crossed the Mars orbital line at 9:47 a.m. 500 warships, each one larger than any human vessel, moved toward the defensive line with weapons hot. Behind them, the rest of the fleet followed in perfect formation. Admiral Kethver expected the humans to fire first. Inferior species always did. They would waste their ammunition on hopeless long-range shots, and then his ships would close in and finish them. It was a pattern he had seen 100 times, but the humans did not fire. They simply waited, their ships hanging in space like they were already dead. Kethver felt the first flicker of unease. This was not normal behavior. Prey species panicked. They fought or they ran. They did not wait in perfect silence like hunters preparing a trap. He pushed the thought away. These were primitives. They had been in space for only 40 years. What could they possibly do against the greatest military force in 3 galaxies? At 9:51 a.m., the Valorian Vanguard entered optimal weapons range. Their targeting systems locked onto the human ships. Energy weapons began to charge. Catherine Brooks watched from Houston. Her screens showed everything: the enemy positions, the human fleet, the hidden weapons that nobody knew about. She took one deep breath and spoke into her command channel. "All ships, this is Fleet Admiral Brooks. You know what we face. You know what we must do. Today we fight for everything that matters. Today we fight for Earth. Today we show them what humanity can do." She paused, and her voice became quiet and hard. "Execute Prometheus Phase 1. Across the void, 300 human ships received the order. They did not hesitate. They did not falter. They simply obeyed, and the greatest battle in human history began. The sky above Earth burned with the light of weapons fire. Somewhere in the darkness between planets, men and women who had never wanted to be warriors became something else entirely. They became the first humans to fight the Valorian hegemony. They would not be the last. The Valorian Vanguard opened fire at 9:52 a.m. 500 warships unleashed their weapons at once, and space itself seemed to scream. Energy beams cut through the void like angry gods reaching down to crush insects beneath their fingers. The human fleet scattered. Ships broke formation and ran in every direction, their engines burning hot as they tried to escape the wall of fire. The Valorian commanders watched with satisfaction. This was expected. This was normal. Prey always ran. Lieutenant Commander Maria Santos stood at her weapons console aboard the cruiser Defiant. She was 31 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a tight ponytail and eyes that showed no fear. She had helped design the weapon systems now coming online across the fleet. She knew exactly what was about to happen. The human ships fled toward Mars, toward the asteroid belt, toward anywhere that was not here. They left behind a trail of small objects, packages no larger than a man's torso, drifting in the void like forgotten garbage. The Valorians did not notice them. They were too busy pursuing the fleeing enemy. Admiral Kethver watched the chase with cold amusement. The humans were faster than he had expected. Their engines were impressive for such a young species, but speed alone would not save them. His ships were already closing the gap. In the first 4 minutes of the battle, The Valorians destroyed 47 human ships. Jake Sullivan watched from the Resolute as the cruiser Bengal exploded in a flower of fire and debris. He had known the captain. They had played cards together just last week. Now Captain Williams was gone, along with 200 crew members. Jake wanted to stop. He wanted to turn and fight. But his orders were clear. Phase 1 was retreat. Phase 1 was sacrifice. Phase 1 was making the enemy believe they were winning. The Valorian fleet pushed deeper into the Mars orbital zone. Their formation spread out as faster ships raced ahead to catch the fleeing humans. They moved through the empty space where the human defensive line had been, their scanners searching for targets. They did not see the mines until it was too late. Catherine Brooks spoke 2 words into her command channel at 10:03 a.m. Her voice was calm and steady. The voice of a woman who had waited 15 years for this moment. Ignite Prometheus. Across the Mars orbital zone, 847 antimatter mines activated simultaneously. They were small devices, each one containing only a few grams of antimatter suspended in magnetic fields. But antimatter does not need to be large to be devastating. The void became light. Maria Santos shielded her eyes as the brightness overwhelmed her screens. The Defiant sensors went blind for 11 seconds. When they came back online, she stared at the display and felt tears running down her cheeks. Thought the Valorian vanguard was gone. Not defeated. Not retreating. Gone. 423 warships had vanished in a cascade of artificial stars. 200 more drifted as burning wreckage. Their crews dead, their weapons silent done in 11 seconds. Humanity had destroyed more ships than any species had ever destroyed in battle against the hegemony. Admiral Kethver stood frozen on his bridge. His tactical display showed only chaos. His vanguard commanders were not responding because they no longer existed. His advance fleet was scattered and confused. And the human ships, the same ships that have been fleeing moments ago, were already turning around. They were coming back. Jake Sullivan pushed the Resolute to full speed as he led his squadron back toward the enemy. Around him, the surviving human fleet reformed with a coordination that seemed impossible. Every captain knew exactly where to go. Every ship moved into position without orders. This was the legacy of Catherine Brooks. For 15 years, she had trained her officers to think alike, to fight alike, to know each other so well that they could operate as a single organism. The Valorians had expected chaos. They found a machine. The human fleet struck the stunned enemy like a hammer. Missiles and railgun rounds tore into ships that were still trying to understand what had happened. The Defiant alone killed 3 enemy cruisers in the first 2 minutes. Maria Santos worked her weapons console with cold efficiency. She did not think about the aliens dying on those ships. She did not think about anything except the next target, the next shot, the next enemy to kill. She had become something new, something hard and sharp and merciless. Admiral Kethver finally found his voice. He screamed orders at his remaining commanders, demanding they reform, demanding they counterattack, demanding they crush these insects who had dared to wound the hegemony. His fleet began to respond. 8,000 ships were still operational. 8,000 ships against fewer than 300. The numbers had not changed enough. Humanity was still outmatched, but something else had changed. Something in the way the Valorians fought. They were careful now. They were hesitant. They watched for traps and checked their scanners twice before advancing. The confidence was gone from their movements. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Valorian hegemony was afraid. Catherine Brooks watched the battle from Houston. She saw the fear in the enemy movements and felt grim satisfaction. Phase 1 had worked better than she had hoped. The Valorians had lost nearly a quarter of their vanguard in seconds. They would not make that mistake again, but she knew this was only the beginning. The mines were spent. The trap was sprung. Now it would come down to skill and courage and sacrifice. Now it would come down to the oldest form of warfare. Ship against ship, crew against crew, will against will. She opened a channel to the fleet. All ships, Phase 1 complete. Execute Phase 2. Make them pay for every inch. Jake Sullivan heard the order and nodded slowly. Phase 2 was simple. Phase 2 was brutal. Phase 2 was fighting until you could not fight anymore. He looked at his crew. They looked back at him. No one spoke. No one needed to. The Resolute turned toward the enemy fleet and accelerated. Behind her, the entire human navy followed. The second phase of the battle had begun. It would last for hours. It would cost thousands of lives on both sides. It would become the most studied military engagement in galactic history. And at the end of it, the galaxy would learn what humanity was capable of when everything they loved was at stake. The Valorians had come to harvest another slave species. They were beginning to understand that they had made a terrible mistake. But understanding would come too late, much too late. By the 4th hour of the battle, the situation had become clear to everyone. Admiral Kethver finally understood what he was facing, and he adjusted his tactics accordingly. He stopped sending ships ahead in eager pursuit. He stopped assuming the humans were weak. He began fighting like a professional. The Valorian fleet reformed into a massive wall of ships, nearly 8,000 vessels moving together in perfect coordination. They advanced slowly, methodically, scanning every piece of debris for hidden weapons. Their formation left no gaps for human ships to exploit. Their fire concentrated on one target at a time, overwhelming each human vessel with dozens of attackers before moving to the next dot. It worked. Human losses mounted with terrible speed. Jake Sullivan watched the cruiser Valiant explode from 17 simultaneous impacts. He had served aboard that ship as a young lieutenant. Now it was gone, along with everyone he had known there. The Resolute took a hit to her port. Side that killed 11 crew members and crippled her secondary weapons. Maria Santos found herself in command of the Defiant when the bridge took a direct hit at 2:17 p.m. Captain Morrison died instantly, along with the first officer and the tactical officer. Maria was in the secondary control room when it happened. One moment she was monitoring weapon systems. The next moment she was the captain. She was not ready. No one could be ready for something like this. But she remembered her training, remembered the doctrine that Catherine Brooks had drilled into every officer in the fleet. Fight smart. Fight hard. Make them pay. She gave her first orders with a voice that shook only slightly. All hands, this is Santos. I have command. Maintain fire. Keep moving. We do not stop until they do. The Defiant killed 2 more enemy ships in the next hour. Maria lost 37 crew members in the same time. The math was impossible. The situation was hopeless. But she kept fighting because stopping was not an option. By hour 6, the human fleet had been reduced to 89 vessels. The Valorians had lost 2,100 ships since the battle began. The exchange rate was remarkable by any standard. No species in hegemony history had inflicted such losses. But it was not enough. It could never be enough. Admiral Kethver looked at his tactical display and felt confidence returning. Yes, these humans were dangerous. Yes, they had hurt him badly. But he still had nearly 6,000 operational warships, and they had fewer than 100. The outcome was certain now. It would just take a little longer than expected. He ordered his fleet to tighten formation and increase speed. The time for caution was over. The time for finishing this was now. Catherine Brooks watched from Houston as the enemy closed in. Her screen showed the cold mathematics of defeat. Ammunition running low, ships failing, crews exhausted. She had thrown everything at the Valorians. The mines were gone. The traps were sprung. The secret weapons were empty. She had one more card to play. One final doctrine that she had prayed would never be necessary. She had created it 3 years ago in a late-night session with her senior commanders. They had called it the Last Light Protocol. They had hoped it would remain forever theoretical. Now it was the only option left. She opened a channel to the surviving fleet. Her face appeared on screens across 89 ships, tired and sad but still strong. All commanders, this is Admiral Brooks. You have fought magnificently. You have done things that no one believed possible. History will remember what happened here today. She paused, gathering herself for what came next. But we cannot win this battle. We do not have enough ships, enough ammunition, enough time. The enemy will reach Earth. They will take our home. There is nothing we can do to stop that now. Across the fleet, men and women who had been fighting for hours listened in exhausted silence. Some wept, some cursed. Most just stared at the screen, waiting for whatever came next. However, Catherine continued, we can ensure that humanity survives. We can carry a warning to our colonies. We can buy time for evacuation. We can preserve something of what we are. Her voice hardened. I am implementing Last Light Protocol. 17 ships have been selected to break through the enemy formation and escape. The rest of us will cover their retreat. The meaning was clear. The covering force would not survive. They would sacrifice themselves so that 17 ships could carry humanity's legacy to the stars. Jake Sullivan received the notification that the Resolute was not among the 17. His ship was too damaged, too slow. She would stay and fight and die with the rest. He felt strangely calm as he read the orders. He had known since the battle began that this was possible. He had made his peace with death somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd hour, when he watched friends die and kept fighting anyway. Linda Hayes, his first officer, put a hand on his shoulder. It has been an honor, sir. Jake nodded. The honor has been mine. Maria Santos received a notification that the Defiant was among the 17. She stared at the message for a long moment, feeling something twist in her chest. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to stay and fight and die with her fellow officers. But someone had to carry the warning. Someone had to survive. She began plotting an escape route through the enemy formation, her hands shaking as she worked. Behind her, the crew of the Defiant prepared for the desperate run that would either save them or destroy them. Catherine Brooks transmitted the final orders at 5:30 p.m. The assault would begin in 30 minutes. Every ship that stayed behind would attack the Valorian flagship directly, creating chaos in the enemy formation. Through that chaos, 17 ships would run for the stars. Catherine knew she would not see the sunrise. The Houston Command Center had been identified by enemy scouts. Orbital bombardment would come soon. But that was acceptable. Her fleet would carry on. Her officers would remember. She looked at the picture of her daughter on her desk, a young woman now living on the new Geneva colony 12 light years away. I love you, sweetheart, she whispered. Make us proud. Then she turned back to her screens and began coordinating humanity's final charge. The assault began at 6 p.m. exactly. 62 human ships turned toward the Valorian flagship and accelerated to maximum speed. They did not try to evade. They did not try to survive. They simply attacked with everything they had left. Jake Sullivan stood on the bridge of the Resolute and watched the enemy grow larger in his viewport. Around him, his crew worked their stations with the calm efficiency of people who had accepted their fate. There was no panic, no fear, only a quiet determination to make their deaths mean something. All weapons, fire at will, Jake said softly. Make every shot count. The Resolute opened fire. Missiles streaked toward the enemy. Railgun rounds punched through alien hulls. Energy weapons carved lines of destruction across Valorian shields. The old destroyer had never fought so hard in her entire service life. Admiral Kethver watched the human attack with confusion. These ships were dying. They had to know they were dying. Yet they pressed forward with a ferocity he had never seen before. They ignored defensive positions. They ignored tactical advantage. They simply threw themselves at his fleet like they wanted to die. No, not like they wanted to die. Like they wanted to hurt him before they went. The Valorian formation buckled under the assault. Ships that tried to maintain position were destroyed by human vessels that crashed directly into them. Ships that broke formation created gaps in the defensive line. And through those gaps, 17 human vessels began to slip away. Maria Santos pushed the Defiant through a gap between two burning Valorian cruisers. Her ship was taking fire from multiple directions. Her shields were failing. Her hull was cracked in 3 places. But she was still moving, still running, still alive. "Come on," she whispered to her ship. "Just a little more. Just a little further." Behind her, the assault force was being torn apart. She watched the destroyer Courage explode as 5 enemy ships concentrated fire on her. She watched the frigate Swift ram directly into a Valorian battleship, both vessels vanishing in a shared death. She watched heroes die so that she could live. Jake Sullivan felt the Resolute shudder as another hit tore through her midsection. Damage reports scrolled across his screen, but he barely looked at them. His eyes were fixed on the Valorian flagship ahead. It was huge, nearly 3 kilometers long, bristling with weapons. It was the heart of the enemy fleet. "Navigation," he said calmly. "Set collision course for the flagship. Engineering, give me everything the engines have left." His crew obeyed without hesitation. The Resolute surged forward, her damaged engines screaming with effort. She was not going to win this fight. She was not going to survive. But she could make her death count. Admiral Kethver saw the human destroyer coming. He ordered his defensive batteries to concentrate fire, and they did. The Resolute took hit after hit after hit. Her shields collapsed. Her hull breached in a dozen places. Atmosphere vented into space. Crew members died at their stations, but she kept coming. Jake felt blood running down his face from a wound he did not remember receiving. The bridge was dark, lit only by emergency lights and the glow of fires that the suppression systems could not contain. Linda Hayes was slumped over her console, unconscious or dead. Chris Parker was still firing the weapons, his hands moving automatically, even as the ship fell apart around him. "Almost there," Jake said, more to himself than anyone else. "Almost there." The Resolute struck the Valorian flagship at full speed. The impact killed everyone aboard instantly, but it also killed everyone in the impact zone of the flagship. And it caused a chain reaction in the alien vessel's power systems that spread through 3 decks. Admiral Kethver died 12 seconds after Jake Sullivan. His flagship broke apart around him, victim of a human destroyer that should have been easy prey. In Houston, Catherine Brooks watched the flagship explode on her screens. She smiled, a tired, sad expression that held no joy. Jake Sullivan had been a good man. He deserved better than this. Her screens flickered. Warning alarms sounded. The enemy had found the command center. "All personnel, evacuate," she ordered. "Get out now." Her staff hesitated, looking at her. "That is an order," she said firmly. "Go." They went, running for the emergency exits. Catherine stayed at her post, watching her screens, tracking the 17 escaping ships as they pushed through the chaos of the battle. The first orbital strike hit the building at 6:47 p.m. The second hit 3 seconds later. The third struck the ruins just to make sure. Catherine Brooks died at her post, watching her people escape. Her last transmission was a single word to the fleet: remember. The battle continued for another 2 hours. The assault force was destroyed completely. Every ship that stayed behind was lost with all hands. But they had done their job. They had created chaos. They had bought time. Of the 17 ships selected to escape, all 17 made it through the enemy formation. They jumped to faster than light speed at 8:19 p.m., disappearing into the void before the Valorians could catch them. Behind them, Earth fell. The Valorian fleet, badly wounded but still overwhelming, moved into orbit and began the occupation. The war for Earth was over, but the war for humanity had just begun. The invasion had started with 9,900 ships. By the time it was over, only 3,100 remained operational. 6,800 Valorian warships had been destroyed, or crippled by a species that had only been in space for 40 years. It was the greatest military disaster in hegemony history. And 17 human ships carried that story to the stars. The Defiant dropped out of faster than light speed above New Geneva Colony on March 19, 2347. 3 days after the Battle of Earth, Maria Santos stood on her damaged bridge and looked at the blue-green world below. It was beautiful. It was alive. It was free. For now. 16 other human ships arrived over the following hours, limping in from their desperate escape. Some were badly damaged. Some had lost half their crews. All of them carried the same message. Earth had fallen, but humanity had not surrendered. Maria took a shuttle down to the surface to meet with the colonial governors. She was exhausted, wounded, grieving. She had not slept more than 4 hours since the battle began. But there was no time for rest. The Valorians would eventually learn about the colonies. They would eventually come to finish what they started. Humanity needed to be ready. The meeting took place in the New Geneva Capitol building, a simple structure of glass and steel that looked out over green fields and distant mountains. 23 people sat around the table: governors, military commanders, scientists, engineers. They represented the 23 million humans who live scattered across 12 colony worlds. They were all that remained of free humanity. Maria told them everything. She described the battle in detail, sparing nothing. She told them about the antimatter mines and the desperate assault and the sacrifice of the covering force. She told them about Jake Sullivan crashing his ship into the enemy flagship. She told them about Catherine Brooks dying at her post. When she finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Governor Patricia Simmons of New Geneva spoke first. She was an older woman with white hair and sharp blue eyes that showed no fear. What do we have to work with? Maria pulled up the numbers on her tablet. 17 ships, all damaged but repairable. The industrial capacity of 12 colony worlds. The agricultural systems to feed our population. The educational infrastructure to train new officers. She paused. And time. The Valorians lost nearly 7,000 ships. They will need to rebuild before they can expand further. We have years, maybe decades, to prepare. Prepare for what? Asked Governor Samuel Drake of the Prosperity Colony. We barely have enough ships to defend one system. How can we possibly fight an empire that spans 3 galaxies? Maria looked at him steadily. The same way we fought them at Earth, with planning, with sacrifice, with weapons they do not expect. We surprised them once. We can do it again. The discussion continued for hours. They argued about strategy, resources, priorities. Some wanted to hide, to make the colonies invisible to Valorian sensors. Others wanted to fight, to begin building a fleet that could one day challenge the hegemony. A few wanted to surrender, to contact the Valorians and beg for terms. That last suggestion was rejected immediately. Every person in the room had watched the recordings from Earth. They had seen what the Valorians did to conquered species. Surrender was not salvation. Surrender was slavery. In the end, they chose to fight. They chose to build. They chose to remember what had been lost and prepare for the day when they could take it back. Maria was named Fleet, commander of the Colonial Defense Force. She was 31 years old, barely qualified for the position by peacetime standards. But peacetime was over. She had survived the Battle of Earth. She had commanded a ship through the worst fighting in human history. That made her more qualified than anyone else left alive. Word of the battle spread across the galaxy faster than any ship could travel. The Mandari traders carried it to 100 worlds. The Kaloth observers transmitted it to their information networks. Species that had lived in fear of the hegemony for 10,000 years heard what humanity had done. They had faced the greatest military force in 3 galaxies and made it bleed. Some species dismissed the reports as exaggeration. The hegemony was invincible. Everyone knew that. No primitive species could possibly destroy nearly 7,000 warships in a single battle. But others listened carefully. Others studied the reports and asked questions. Others began to wonder if the Valorian hegemony was really as unstoppable as they had always believed. On the occupied Earth, the Valorians established their control with brutal efficiency. They collected humans for labor. They stripped resources from the planet. They did what they had done to 200 other worlds before. But something was different this time. The humans did not submit quietly. Resistance cells formed within weeks of the occupation. Sabotage struck Valorian installations. Information flowed secretly to the colonial networks. Even in defeat, even in chains, humanity refused to stop fighting. The Valorian occupation commanders reported these troubles to their superiors. They requested additional troops, additional ships, additional resources. The humans were more difficult than expected. They required more force to control than any species the hegemony had ever conquered. The superiors read these reports with growing concern. The humans had already cost them dearly. How much more would they cost before they were finally broken? On New Geneva, Maria Santos stood at a window in her new office and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, beyond the darkness, Earth waited. Her home waited. The ghosts of Jake Sullivan and Catherine Brooks and 50,000 other heroes waited. She had found a recording in the Defiance communication logs during the journey to New Geneva. It was Jake Sullivan's final message, transmitted from the resolute moments before impact. His voice was calm, almost peaceful, as he spoke. They think they have won because they have taken our home. They do not understand. Home is wherever we stand together. Home is in the hearts of our children and the memory of our dead. They have not conquered humanity. They have only given us a reason to become what we were always meant to be. We were farmers and dreamers and poets who reached for the stars. Now we are something else. Now we are the storm. And one day, when they have forgotten what they did here, we will remind them. We will remind the entire galaxy. This is what happens when you try to break humanity. We do not break. We become unbreakable. Maria had listened to that recording many times. She had memorized every word. She had shared it with every officer in the surviving fleet. Now she looked at the stars and made a silent promise to the dead. We will come back. We will rebuild. We will grow strong. And one day, we will return to Earth with a fleet that makes the Valorians tremble. The invasion had begun with 9,900 ships. Only 17 had escaped the slaughter, but those 17 carried something more powerful than weapons. They carried hope. They carried memory. They carried the promise of a reckoning to come. The Valorian hegemony had conquered 200 species. They had never lost a war. They had never met a species that refused to accept defeat, even when defeat was certain. Now, they had and deep in the darkness between stars. In shipyards hidden on colonial worlds, humanity began to build its answer. The war was not over. It had only just begun.